Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be finishing up our series, The Good, the Bad, and Philosophy, or at least the first half of it. Stay tuned to the end for more information on that. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is target-centered virtue ethics. Now, although other theories of virtue ethics try to explain virtue in terms of either what makes up virtue, they try to build up building blocks to get to what virtue is, as agent-centered theories do, either through the motivations of the agent who we're talking about, or the motivations of a paragon, or maybe what virtues contribute to, as eudaimenistic theories might do, in that we can define our virtues based on what would make up a good life, and that helps define the virtues. Target-centered theories of virtue ethics take the virtues themselves as basic, and focus more on how one can have a virtue, how the virtues interact, and importantly, how we can build a theory of right action out of a theory of virtue ethics. As the name suggests, target-centered theories are going to be leaning more towards kind of consequentialist pictures of ethics, while the agent-centered theories that we looked at last time lean a little bit more towards the deontological. Agent-centered care more about motivations. The target-centered, though motivations or the mode, the way in which you embody a virtue are going to be important, what really matters at the end of the day is whether or not you hit the target. Whether or not you're successful in doing whatever that virtue tries to do. Let's take a look. So, often the elements of target-centered theories of virtue ethics are separated into four different categories: the field, the basis, or the basis of acknowledgement, the target, and the mode, or the mode of response. Each virtue has all of these four elements, and they define it and how they interact, just as Aristotle defined the virtues using the means between different vices on a spectrum of emotional reaction. So, first off, the field. The field of a particular virtue is similar to kind of the emotion or the general landscape under Aristotle's theory. It answers the question, what is the virtue generally about? What type of thing does it concern? The field of honesty might be concerned with how we communicate with others. The field of humility might be concerned with how we see or view ourselves. The field of courage could be about those things which might damage or threaten us. And the field of generosity could be concerned with how we act towards ownership, sharing, and equality. The field is the general topic that a virtue concerns. Now, the basis of acknowledgement for a particular virtue is what within the field the virtue is specifically going to address or concentrate on. The basis is kind of the concentrated down part of the field. It's okay, we're talking about communication, for example, with honesty, but what's the virtue trying to address within communication? It's trying to attend to truth of statements and how they impact others. Humility might specifically hit on seeing ourselves in a realistic light, not just how we see ourselves generally. Courage attends directly to threats against things we care about. Generosity deals specifically with things which we own, which might help others more than us. If the field is the general area that a virtue might deal with, the basis is specifically what that virtue is about, or what problem in that field that virtue is trying to deal with or solve. The target of the virtue is the intended consequence. What is the goal of exemplifying this virtue? Or put another way, what ends would we get if this virtue was done correctly? For honesty, this might be trust and relationships. For humility, this might be growth of a weakness and embracing of strengths. For courage, it could be dealing with a threat and managing fear. For generosity, it might be giving to others those things which you have, out of which they might get more good. If the virtue is correctly embodied, then the target will be achieved. And as we'll see in how we're judging right action, what really matters in this whole process is whether or not the target is actually achieved. Which makes this feel, as I said, a little bit more consequentialist than some of the other versions of virtue ethical theories. And finally, the mode represents the how of the process. This is the way that the basis connects with the target of the virtue. What is that way? Honesty fosters truth by expressing feelings and beliefs truthfully. With humility, we grow our weakness and accept our strengths by accurately assessing our capabilities and accepting those assessments. Courage handles threats by defending what we care about most, and generosity benefits others by maximizing the good to be gained from particular possessions. So the mode is the how of the process. So it might be summarized like this: the field is the general area a virtue deals with, the basis is the specific thing that a virtue is targeting, the mode is how we get from that basis to a particular target or a goal in reality, which is what we want if that virtue were done perfectly well. For a target-centered theory of virtue, an act is right if it hits the target of the virtue. This becomes difficult when you have multiple fields which overlap, or multiple virtues which concern the same action, as frequently you do when you're making a difficult decision about morality. Particular acts are rarely just based on simple virtues with single targets. These multiple virtues often conflict. To address this issue, target theorists fall into three camps: perfectionists, permissivists, and minimalists. And we're going to take a look at these right now. So target ethicists that subscribe to perfectionism are going to require that good actions be those actions which hit all the targets of the relevant virtues. In other words, the one good action is the best possible action in a particular situation. This is going to be the most restrictive theory. So if I have a choice which concerns things such as honesty and humility and courage, I need to hit the targets of all of those virtues under the perfectionist theory for my action to be right, or for it to be good. If I don't hit all of those targets, if there's one that I miss and I'm actually being cowardly, even if I'm being honest and humble, I'm going to fail to do the right action under the perfectionist theory. Permissivists, on the other hand, are going to create a standard of the percent or amount of virtues, perhaps half of the virtues, whose targets need to be met in order to consider an action right. This, therefore, is somewhere in between the minimalist standard for a good action and the perfectionist standard for a good action. So the permissivists might say, well, maybe you can be cowardly as long as you're both humble and honest, you're fine. As long as you hit two of the three targets, you're okay. But if you only hit one of the three targets, that act really wasn't virtuous. And depending on what kind of permissivist you are, you may draw that line in a different place. And finally, minimalists will claim that an action is right if at least one of the virtues hits its target. So even if most of the virtues fail to hit their target, the very permissive minimalists will allow for an action to still be right if one of them does. So if I wasn't honest and I wasn't courageous, but at least I was humble, the minimalist might still call that a good action because it wasn't completely bad. It didn't solely deal with vice. There was at least some element of virtue there, so the minimalist is going to let me get away with it. Even more so than other theories of virtue ethics, this is definitely going to suffer from the problem of cultures disagreeing on what should be counted as a virtue, or even points in time disagreeing on what should be counted as a virtue, or what should be the basis, mode, target of particular virtues. Since this theory takes those as basic and builds up from them, they in principle can't give reasons why certain things are virtues and others are not. They take those as assumptions. So if someone disagreed that courage was a virtue, or modesty was a virtue, or wittiness was a virtue, then they wouldn't have anything to argue with them against other than saying, well, I just assume that it is. Which is always concerning for me as a skeptic when people are just making these blatant assumptions. Additionally, I've got some concerns about all three of the theories of right action. It seems that if we are always requiring our virtues to hit all of their targets, in the perfectionist picture, there are many situations that one might be in where at least one virtue cannot succeed in hitting its targets. while you might say, well, maybe the perfectionist only wants the best possible outcome, so the most targets that you could possibly hit. Even so, it seems like ethical theories should be there to tell us specifically what to do in those situations. But the target virtue ethical theory seems to punt in those situations by saying that, do whatever actually hits all the targets, and if you can't hit all the targets, do the best situation after that. But isn't really clear what that would be. Which of those targets should we give up on? Should I choose to be courageous and honest but not humble? How do we manage that? Those seem to be the real questions of ethics. But these theories seem to completely fail to help us decide between them. And the perfectionist might even say that we're wrong no matter what we do. The permissivist and the minimalist seem to open themselves up to criticisms that they treat all virtues as the same. Not killing people seems more important than not lying. But if these two are at odds with each other, let's say you could save someone's life by lying, it doesn't seem that either course of action is equally good, as the minimalist might be committed to. Now, the permissivist might be able to throw in some extra rules that would define certain virtues as better than others, but there's a lot of machinery to be built out there to actually create a full theory. And as before, both of these theories, at least as they are right now, fail to tell us which path to take when faced with a dilemma. The minimalist says, an action's good as long as it hits the target of at least one of the virtues, but it doesn't tell me which virtue I should try to hit in that situation. And that seems really problematic, because it seems that the actual ethical dilemmas we face in the world are between deciding which target should I hit, which virtue should I stick with, which value should I value the most. And if our theory can't tell us that, what's the point of having an ethical theory to begin with? That was target-centered virtue ethics. Next up, we're going to be looking at some modern ethical dilemmas, and we're going to look at what we think deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics would say about those dilemmas. Actually bringing some of the tools of philosophy to bear on real problems or cultural debates or issues in our world today. So stay tuned for those videos. I'm really excited for them. I think they're going to be a lot of fun. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.